Welcome to Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment, a podcast by Chefalo Consulting, where we share the knowledge, stories, and resources you need to create a trauma-informed culture that supports wellness, growth, and resilience. I'm your host, Shenandoah Chefalo. Welcome! So glad to have you all with us today. On today's episode of Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment, I'm delighted to offer and have on and welcome longtime friend Dr. Robert Shaner, who's a distinguished executive with extensive experience in leading the development, strategic planning, and execution of multi-million-dollar initiatives in both education and workforce development. Currently serving as the Vice President of Talent, Education, and Workforce Development at Lyft, Bob is known for his dynamic leadership and adeptness in fostering environments that prioritize trauma-informed practices. His efforts focus on creating workplaces that are not only productive, but also deeply understanding of the diverse emotional and psychological needs of employees. Join us as we explore his approach to integrating trauma-informed principles into the fabric of workplace culture and enhancing both employee well-being and organizational effectiveness. And maybe one of the most vulnerable and inspirational people in my travels that I've met. Bob, welcome. It's so great to have you today.
Oh, thank you, Shen. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's an honor to have you in my life.
I say this to my listeners and to people when I'm speaking all the time that I sometimes feel like I collect people, which I don't say, not in kind of a weird way, but because I get to travel all over the country and internationally and do this work, and because I wrote the book and kind of come from that place of vulnerability, often I think it allows people to be vulnerable with me, even when we're strangers. And Bob, I distinctly remember my first interaction and meeting you, and I thought, it was in education at the time. You were working in education at the time. And I thought, I've not met a superintendent like this before. They're usually pretty buttoned up. And your physical appearance itself, right, Bob? A real kind of, I was like, and then you said some things that I was like, this outside does not match this inside with Bob.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to tell our listeners sort of maybe just a little bit about you, your background, of course, but maybe also in that you'll share any pivotal moments that you've had in your career that have set you on the path to doing the work you're doing now.
Yeah. Let's talk about my background a little bit because the outer shell doesn't match
Yeah.
the soft, sweet inside. I sound like an M&M. Yeah, I grew up in a blue-collar environment in Southeast Michigan. You know, kind of lived the son of a skilled tradesman's life.
Yeah.
You know, went to the local high school, lived a middle-class life, played football, had a great time in high school. You know, just lived that hard-scrabble life. My dad had 10 kids in his family, my mom 6. A lot of uncles all my uncles were veterans, actually, in some shape or form. And when I got to the end of my high school career, I decided I wanted to lead Marines. And I think that might be where the hard outside shell comes from, so to speak, or the facade. And maybe I was that person at some point. But I am proud of my service in the Marine Corps, but it also comes with some significant scar tissue that I've had to deal with. And so I joined the Marine Corps. I went to college. I joined the Marine Corps at the same time. I went to the University of Detroit. And when I graduated from the University of Detroit, I was commissioned as an officer in the Marine Corps and was stationed out in California with a Special Operations Command. Was not a special operations operator per se, but I worked within special operations and deployed to Somalia and spent 3 months in Somalia and returned from Somalia and really got out of the Marine Corps, got off active duty really quickly. I stayed in the reserves for a while. And it was the first time, I think, when I returned home and I look back on this now, a lot of this is hindsight, right? I wish I could have known how I felt then, but I look back on it, I certainly came home and had the classic experience of something's different. I don't fit in like I used to. I don't know what's wrong. I don't know what's bothering me. And that's something that kind of I lived with for, the next several years as I experienced a bunch of other compounded trauma. Keep the story concise, I got home and I went hunting and fishing for about 3 months. My dad said, "Hey, son, I understand transition, but maybe you ought to get a job."
Only a dad can say that, right? Only a blue collar dad too, right?
Yeah, I was substitute teaching at the time, and I'd gone to college to be a teacher, and it was always something I was passionate about and good at. But I went and joined the police department and worked in two different police departments for 7 years. And again, addicted to the adrenaline of fast-paced operations and dangerous stuff.
Oh, yeah. We're going to get into that, right? But I think for our listeners, this is an important piece of understanding because this is also when we talk about the neurobiology of trauma, like we know the original study started with veterans with PTSD. We know that this addiction to adrenaline makes for really toxic workplaces when we fast forward and we see what happens, right? That need to constantly be doing, to constantly be going, to constantly be solving. So it's an important one. So the Marines to becoming a police officer, that seems like a natural transition.
Yep, it was perfect pathway to continue on the adrenaline. I very quickly got on the SWAT team, worked in narcotics, that sort of thing. Went to another police department, again, got on the SWAT team, did that sort of work. Luckily, though, I got into being a juvenile detective at my last police department. Got me back into working with young people, which I enjoyed very much. It was one of the few places in police work that I really, really felt like I was helping people. Although there was a lot of tragedy with that. I investigated sex crimes, a lot of child abuse. But when we were really working with young people, you felt like you were really connecting and trying to help them. And luckily, I was approached by the principal of my alma mater where I went to high school and said he'd heard that I had a teaching degree and offered me a job, basically. And I essentially hung up my badge and my gun on the Friday of Labor Day weekend and started teaching Sterling Heights High School in Sterling Heights, Michigan, the Tuesday after Labor Day, and kind of never looked back. And then I'd only taught for about 4 years, really. I took a $25,000 pay cut to become a teacher. My wife was very supportive of that. We kind of figured that out and went into administration pretty quickly and went into the position of leadership. And that was, I think, two things. I had a penchant for leadership. I certainly liked chasing the challenge. And the other part of it was monetary. I knew I could make up my income pretty quickly by doing that.
Yeah. So you made your way into education. And we've had this conversation previously when you were superintendent. What's really the difference between being a police officer and a superintendent? Our listeners may think there's a big difference, but you and I have talked about they might be more similar than people think.
Yeah, I think so too. It was interesting when I was going to grad school for my master's degree. I said to one of the educators, this isn't really a whole lot different than police work. And she is, "How so?" I said, "Well, it's fast paced. You're dealing with people all the time. You got to learn how to talk to people. You've got to solve problems. There's a lot to it and that is similar." And I would say the similarities for me, particularly to the superintendency, was that constant going, having problems to attack, people to help, being the guy that can, people, when bad things happen, people call you and you're the person that gets to fix it, or perceivedly so. So I think there's a lot to it like that. The difference in regular police work and working the street is when you work as a patrol officer, 90% of the time you're picking up somebody else's mess, right? You're not fixing anything. You're kind of the cleanup on aisle 9, figuratively sometimes and literally sometimes. With the exception of, I would say, working as a juvenile detective. That was a different vein of police work. But for me, I think when you look back at my leadership journey, luckily, I don't think I ever created a toxic work environment for anyone else. I certainly probably made it toxic for myself in terms of my own self-care. And, we're so trite about the term self-care, and we can talk about that later, but I really like to get into that because it's not as easy as people think it is. But, I would say the similarity between my experience in the military, the police department, and as an executive up until a couple of years ago was inability for myself to quiet down, be alone with myself, and really intentionally work on taking care of yourself. And that's something that really, really took a toll.
Yeah, I want to hit on some of that here because one of the things that I watched you do, and I've actually talked about this in other trainings, which you may not know about,
Nope.
but only Bob can. So I was fortunate enough, Bob hired me when he was superintendent to come in and do some training with his staff. And we were actually off on a good start of doing some trauma informed work there in your old district before COVID hit. And then, of course, COVID, wrangled everybody into a lot of different directions. But we were, Bob and I were speaking at a welcome back assembly, and I had just done some work, and Bob came up on stage and he had kind of this look of panic in his eye. And if you're a facilitator or trainer like me, when the person in charge has that look, either one, you've said something you shouldn't have said and you're about to get reamed, or two, they're going to do something that they didn't expect themselves to do. Luckily for me, it was the second. It was the latter rather than the first. That's always the better position to be in. And you said, I think I want to say something really vulnerable to the staff.
Yeah.
And do you think it would be okay? And I was surprised because again, this kind of goes into my initial about you, Bob, that you're right. Listen, white, like middle-aged guy, right? Like cisgendered guy, like wearing the suit buttoned up. I knew you had a military background. I knew your police background. You're the superintendent of this school. Like my own assumptions are filling in, right? And
Yeah. The suit's just to cover up my tattoo, Shen.
yeah, I know. But like I know that now, Bob. But you get your own assumptions. I mean, it was a good double check for me, but you had been, we had talked about it in the training
Yeah.
and you had been kind of quiet in training, which is common when I'm dealing with leaders, executive leaders, that they're not sure when they can be vulnerable, when they can't be vulnerable, and they do this. But you then stood up in front of your entire staff and did something completely vulnerable. And in that 2.5 minutes, that 3 minutes you spoke, it wasn't that long. I watched that room and the culture of that organization shift immensely. Because even though it was before COVID, it was still a high pressure time in education.
It's a high pressure time in education. And I think it was a culture in the district that I was in that, vulnerability was not part of the culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just wondering about some of those initial challenges you faced in your career. And you said like hindsight's 2020 when you talk about coming back from the military, doing that, those transition times in your life. And you've had a couple of them. I'm just wondering what led you in that moment to be vulnerable. What was happening for you that you thought this is the time and place to do things differently?
I think to your point, people perceived me in a way of leadership that wasn't congruent with who I am on the inside. And it was time for them to know. I wanted to let them know that it was okay for them to be vulnerable and authentic as well, which, I think we were probably somewhat successful with some people because everyone's got to make the decision to be able to live in that way. But for me, it was about being an authentic leader. And I've always been a leader that's worn my heart on my sleeves, right? Like when people talk about, being in the Marine Corps and all, being machismo and charging up hills and jumping out of helicopters and all that stuff, the reality of it is I didn't do that stuff for, God, country, and Corps as much as I did for my Marines because, they followed me because I loved them and they loved me. And that's not a very machismo thing to talk about, but when you work in an organization where actual unconditional love exists, you get a lot of stuff done and you have people that really deeply care about each other.
Yes, 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 yes. Like, cause and I think it's so, like, I love that you're saying love, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what we're trying to say is, and how do we have healthy love? Because so many of us haven't had healthy love in our lives. So we recreate in the workplace what we've had personally, right? And so for many of us, myself included, if you've grown up under unhealthy love, It's no wonder we end up in toxic work cultures really quickly, right? Because we recreate what we know and our experiences. So I'm just wondering, kind of throughout your career, all of these challenges that have required different things from you. How do you navigate that? And what's your advice maybe for leaders who are trying to navigate? Because I also think we're in an interesting point in just in our nation right now. Like we're kind of at this crossroads of transition, as you will, which is the way it's always been, right? Make it great again. And this idea of a lot of people have been left out for a long time of conversations, of spaces and places. How do we navigate that? How do we welcome our what can be perceived as weaknesses? Although Bob, you and I have talked about vulnerability is never a weakness. But how do we encourage leaders to use their vulnerability?
I think it's a really challenging thing, right? Especially right now, because you might get attacked on your vulnerability. And, in my experience, particularly in the last 2 years of my superintendency, after my son passed away, I think that was, for some folks, that was a rich environment to attack me because they knew I was in a bad way, right? But I would go back to this, that's really intentional work, and you have to work on yourself before you decide to do that with other folks. And I think back when we first met, Shen, I was intentionally doing some of that work at that point, but I think it was more of the tip of the iceberg and not what was under the water. And, this is the thing, the universe will get you every time. One way or another, you're going to have to face it. I learned that on the ranch at Heroes and Horses. I've learned that from you. And this is the problem with the notion of self-care and leaders. And this happened over and over again when I was in the school district. I don't know how many times we had tragic, traumatic events, right? I have helped more people bury their children than I can actually remember the count of. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about to kind of cut to the point. The October after my son had passed away, friends of ours, a child had been hit by a car outside one of our high schools. What does Bob do? He runs to the fire, runs right over there, give me the printout of who was laying in the street over there. They hand me a piece of paper, and it's the daughter of really good friends of mine. And so the mother is Kathy, the girl's mother, asked me to come to the emergency room and meet them at the emergency room because she was an ER nurse in that emergency room. I went to the hospital and sat with them and got the report of the condition of their daughter who had passed away after that, right?
So sorry.
And it was interesting to me. I'd already been pretty regularly in therapy at that point and trying to deal with some of my past demons in an authentic kind of way. But every time that I went to another leader and said, hey, I'd like you to go for debriefing, it was short of me saying you must go for debriefing. It was, hey, that's good for someone else. Let's get someone to debrief the staff, but I'm good. And it is such rubbish. It's so ridiculous and I think I don't know if it's fear. I don't know what it is, and until you're intentionally ready to work on your own compounded trauma, your own story, what's below the waterline, if to make that analogy to an iceberg, I don't know that you can really help other people through it, right? And I think that's a fundamental problem right now in our country because it leads to misunderstanding. It leads to people being mean. When I was superintendent, again, I've been a public servant since I've been 18 years old.
Yeah, that's right.
The governor calls and asks if I'll serve on a panel to help get kids back in school during COVID. And next thing you know, it got politicized and I'm getting attacked. And I just wonder how the world got to a point where, and it wouldn't have mattered who the governor was at the time, honestly. It's no different than I went to Washington, D.C. to work on mental health. And, President Trump was in the room, was asked to serve, and I went. But how we got to a point of being able to lash out at other people and project, and so much of it's projecting what's going on in your own body and projecting that energy onto other humans. It's really, the notion of self-care. This is the thing that drives me nuts about leaders and self-care. Oh yeah, I'll go get a pedicure, have a glass of wine and get a massage and I'll be good. That's not what I'm talking about. It is really, really intentional, difficult, and deliberate work.
Yeah. You and I've had this, we're fortunate enough to get to have private conversations. That's part of the podcast, right? Is like, how can I take some of the private conversations I get to have with amazing humans and let people kind of listen into the things that we talk about. And that's the thing. You and I are both passionate about this self-care piece. And people say this sometimes when I'm in these 3-day trainings, which is, I'm like, it's not your boss, it's you. This work is you. I hear it all the time. Well, my boss won't buy in, the leader won't buy in. And I'm just like, but you can be trauma informed. You can be healthy. You can do the things and start the parallel process. But you're so right. I mean, we'll just say it. It's bullshit that self care is about going for a run or working out or having a glass of wine or hanging out with your buddies. Those are things that give you joy and you should go do them. Like, I don't want anybody to stop doing, to your point, the pedicures and bubble baths, but that's not self-care. That's just stuff that makes you happy. Please, please, please go do things that make you happy and refill your tank. But real self-care is personal development, which is what you're saying. Real self care is, why are these things triggering me? Why am I mad that someone's trying to get kids back in school? Why is that triggering me? What are my boundaries, which you and I have talked about a lot? What are the things I'm tolerating? What do I even value? Most people that I run into when I say, tell me your values, they can name a few buzzwords. But when I say, well, show me how that shows up in your life every day, they're not really connected to, right? Those pieces of our, like, the intentionality of, like, oh, my mom and dad told me I should care about other people. So one of my values is I care about other people. It's like, but you're kind of mean to other people, right? Like, this piece of, like, we say one thing, but our actions aren't showing that. That's the personal development piece, right? And being intentional and being healthy with, I got to work through my own stuff. I got to let Bob work through his stuff. I can't fix Bob. Bob can't fix me. And how do we have enough space to know Shen's doing the best she can today and Bob's doing the best he can? And that might look different tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's part of, in my life right now, that's part of finding forgiveness and closure of people that have potentially wronged me. Number one, they've probably done the best they can. They can't do any better. And number two, they have to live with who they are and live and work on their stuff. I think back to, I wasn't a violent person in a different version of myself, but I did have a pretty trip hammer temper about really stupid stuff that I paid, that I spent energy on. And it's something I say to my wife all the time. Nowadays, it's not worth the energy. It's just, that is not worth my energy to spend thinking about or lamenting about. And that requires discipline. I say this all the time to folks. This work requires, it's intentional, it's hard, and it requires a practice. It's not a lot different than yoga. When a yoga instructor doesn't say, how did today go at yoga? They say, how is your practice? That's the question they ask you. And to me, this journey for me has been a practice, right? And there's been a lot of gifts the universe has given me. But for a long time, I was probably so angry and so profoundly hurt that I couldn't even see those gifts in my life, right? I wasn't deliberate enough to say, slow down and see what the universe is giving you.
So, Bob, just because I know the story, and I know we're not going to get into the details of it on the podcast today, but as you started to become sort of your authentic self in education, there was a lot of pushback to that.
Yep.
A lot of people didn't like it. How did you stay grounded and not lose yourself and go back to kind of old Bob for safety, right? Because you could have, like, you're living intentionally, you're working on yourself, you're living your truth, you're being vulnerable, all the things we ask of leaders to do. And you got not positive feedback from doing it. Like, it wasn't a positive environment for you to do that. What do you think allowed you, or how did you say, I'm not going back to old Bob, even though that would have been the easy path, right?
Yeah, I think the work we were doing in the school district, it was just strongly, my convictions about doing right by kids and the staff were really important, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a little bit of my programming from the Marine Corps. And maybe, I guess it served me the way it served me. But, when I was just talking to someone else about this, when I was a young lieutenant, it was exciting And it was cool, especially in training, thinking about, oh, we're training for war. We're going to go to war. Well, until you get into a war and they kick the ammunition open on the deck of a ship and say, take as much as you can carry, boys. We don't know what's going to happen when you get in there. You have to come to grips with the fact that in order to lead other people effectively, you have to basically consider that you're probably not going to make it. Like you're not going to survive. And you have to be okay with that. Like you have to almost concede the fact that you're already dead. And I think, that's not a good way to live.
No.
I'm not advocating for that, but I think that's a little bit of the way I was at the school district, right? The good thing was I had really strong convictions about what I wanted to accomplish for kids and the staff. I think maybe the bad thing and I said this to the staff over our DEIA initiatives, I guess if I'm going to get fired, this is something to get fired over because it's really important work, and I know I can't really talk about any of that, but the reality of it is it did end well, right? And the thing is you don't need to live like that to be an effective, authentic leader. But I think the other part of it is once I got into that and realized that there wasn't anyone coming to help me, right? All the other people that I worked with were doing the best they could. They weren't going to help me. They weren't going to, in a lot of ways, stand behind me in an authentic kind of way. I had to decide whether I was going to move forward with who I am or stand still in my own growth. And I guess I don't know that I decided, Shen. The reality of it is I didn't have a choice, right? The choice is someone asked me, and about my experience at Heroes and Horses. For the disclosure of the listeners, I'm a disabled veteran. I've got pretty significant PTSD, and I went to a program out in Montana for 41 days with horses and that sort of thing to learn how to reprogram myself.
That we would highly recommend for anybody who needs it, right? So we'll make sure that there's even links there to that program and that work.
Yeah. But the reality of it is, someone asked me when I was out volunteering this year, helping out with some other veterans, how did you get here? How did you find this place? And the story is pretty amazing about how I found it, and we won't get into that right now. But the truth of the matter is the honest answer is I was at the end of my rope and I didn't know what else to do. But I had done enough practice I knew I had to do something, right? And I had to make a bold change and look for something that was going to help me grow past where I was at that point in my life. And that's the hard work that, number one, you have to choose, you have to commit, and then you have to practice. And that is really difficult for people.
Well, first we'll applaud you for taking the leap because it's a leap, I think. You can choose something different. As you said, it is a choice. But the common theme of almost everybody I've had on the show and even some of the guests we have coming up is you're at the end of the rope. I mean, it takes almost all of us getting back in the corner. Myself, we just had Dr. Yu on the podcast last week and same. It's, he talks about that he was having suicidal ideation. He was at the end, and for him, it was faith, right? He turned to the church, and the faith is where he went. And then he saw some issues within the faith community, and that's propelled him to do some work within faith communities. But similar to you, it's like we're at the end of this rope. And I think the reason all of us, you, me, Dr. Yu, Chuck Price, who's been on, do this work is we want people to make the choice before they get to the end of the rope.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like, we're like, wait, there is a better way. Like, we all had to go to like the end of our rope and say, it's now or never. How can we help other people do it sooner?
Yeah. Make the choice not to live in fear or agony, right? And I think for some people, the known agony is more comfortable for them than taking the leap of the unknown and entering into the journey and living a journey, right?
Yeah.
And, it's interesting. I kind of look over my career and think, where in the heck did the last 30 years go? And the answer is the last 30 years, I wasn't present. I wasn't enjoying the unfolding of the journey. I was forcing the journey, right? And that's something I just have to move forward and learn from. And I would really encourage people to think about that from a development standpoint of who they are, what they want to commit to, and what they're willing to practice and risk, right? I remember one time on the ranch, Micah said to me, you really almost have to be willing to die to choose. And he meant that metaphorically. I don't think he meant physically die, but you almost have to be willing to become a different person to be able to truly change. And you have to engage in really difficult stuff. At the ranch, you did every day. We did a side of the horses. We did some group work. We did meditation. We did cold water and sauna. And I remember the first time I got in the cold water, I didn't want to get in it. I'm 50 some years old. There's a bunch of younger veterans with me. The water's 45 degrees. And I got in and barely. And Michael looked at me and said, "Hey, you got to do it for real." And he didn't mean just get in the cold water for real. Like, you got to open your mind, heart, and soul to this whole process and do it for real and see what comes. And that was really hard for me not to be in control. And one of the things I thought about when I went to the ranch was, I was always leading all my life since I was a captain on the football team as a leader. And I decided when I was going to go to the ranch that I wasn't going to lead anything. I wasn't going to be a leader. I was just going to be. And I remember we were in the North Absaroka Wilderness, and someone handed me the map one morning and said, "Here, you lead us today." And I'm like, "Nope, not doing that." And they kind of looked at me and said, "I'm really not doing that." And it was the first time, I think, that I made a conscious decision to actually practice what I said I was going to choose to do, right? Like, I'm not going to be that guy anymore.
To say no.
Yes, to say no and to not have to be the guy all the time.
I just want to pause because, first off, my heart is giving you a round of applause, Bob. Like, I'm just like, but because that's the work.
Yeah.
That's the work. And this idea of choosing, for me, I went to Atlanta, Georgia, because I was going to take some coaching to help our clients, right? I was going to learn coaching as a tool to help our clients make better decisions. And I've told that story a lot of times. And I found myself on the floor of a hotel room in the fetal position because I basically, like some of the leaders you've talked about, was like, "No, I'm good. I'm good. Don't need to talk about anything." And at that point, I hadn't told anybody, including my spouse, about my time in foster care. I told no one. And I was just good. I was good. And now that I've intentionally started working on myself, after being on the floor of a hotel room in the fetal position with somebody saying, "How are you going to tell people that they should choose something different when you're not willing to choose something different?"
Yeah.
Which was a valid point, and it was heard by me, but it hurt, right? It hurt so deeply to say, I'm failing myself, because I just had spent my entire childhood trying to be the person who was doing everything everybody wanted me to do. I really tried to be the good girl. I really tried to do everything everybody asked of me. And to your point of having to say, "I can't take the map today."
Yeah. And it's interesting because you never would say no, right? Particularly in my childhood, that's how you got noticed is you distinguished yourself. And you distinguished yourself by taking more, and sacrificing yourself, right?
That's right.
And that's for a lot of leaders, that's the metaphor that we live in, right? Like, we can take the hill, but the good guy doesn't make it all the way to the top, or it doesn't survive, or good girl, and it's so wrong, right?
Or people like me, right? People like me don't get those opportunities. People like me can't. I remember saying all of those things. Even as much as the podcast, people kept saying, "Shen, you should start a podcast." I was like, people like me don't start a podcast. No, nobody wants to hear what I have to say. But it's that mindset that's rooted in those really early traumas of my life.
Oh yeah, you don't deserve it. Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
I was in a sweat lodge with my Lakota friend Luke, and we came out of the sweat lodge, and he's like, "I could feel it in there. You feel like, number one, what's happened to you, you deserved it. And number two, you feel like you don't deserve good things." And he's like, until you wrap your head around the fact that both of those things are false and the universe just is, you're going to have a really difficult time.
I have to take a breath of just even listening to you say that because it's so important. And sometimes I don't know if this podcast is for others or if it's for me. which is just the truth.
I felt like that coming into it. I mean, maybe I don't know why I was looking forward to it more for,
Because it's just so true. I just had an experience this week. In fact, Tuesday, I was asked to do a keynote in Austin, Texas. And after I actually didn't know how the keynote went. And listen, I'm my hardest critic. I know, Bob, you're your hardest critic as well. And
oh yeah, for sure.
I couldn't really get a read on the audience in this particular kind of the way the space was set up, all the things. And just wasn't sure how it settled in. And then afterwards, 6, 8, 10 people lined up to kind of ask questions or say something. And it's hard for me to hear when people say, thank you for sharing. That's always been something that's like, oh, like I never know what the right response is for me. And I try to be real intentional with that. But older gentleman waited and I could kind of see him in the back waiting. And he came up and said to me, I don't know how you'll take this, Shen, but some people have black magic and some people have white magic, and you're definitely white magic. And I thought, I got to sit with that. And I think just listening to you, how our stories change us, I think matters. Our ability to lead into vulnerability matters. But man, making space in systems, especially complicated systems, you in the education space, I get to work in a lot of judicial systems. We're trying to get more police officers trained, as you know, in this realm. This is something you and I spend a lot of time talking about.
Absolutely.
But what do you think? If you could like wave a magic wand, Bob, what is like one principle or value you think, like if you could just instill it, it would make maybe significant change or difference?
Authentic self-reflection.
Say more. Tell our listeners more.
Yeah. So, and that go with being alone with yourself, right? Like getting out of your own head and truly being alone with who you are and feeling it. Self-help is hard work. And sometimes it's hard work because it's living through those traumas and those experiences. And, you might cry because it's worth crying over. You might feel a lot of different things. But if you don't feel them, they just compound in who you are and affect your personality. So I think many, many leaders, self-reflecting on your leadership practice, that's one thing. Like, okay, we did these things, this work. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really, whether it's meditating, I don't know, I'm a big fan of meditation in a way that you really need to be alone with yourself, right? And that was another thing that Micah taught me, I think, is, you're not going to get away from the pain. Like, I don't know, the listeners probably don't know, but I lost my son to suicide in 2021, January of 21. And, it's such a hot pain that, you just want to get away from it. You want to, however you can, or ignore it. And the reality of it is you are not going to get away from that pain. No more than I'm going to get away from the pain of when I was serving in Somalia. And, I listened to a man beg me to shoot him for 2 hours on the streets of Mogadishu. I have to sit with that and feel it and process it. And I think particularly police officers, and the nature of police work is that, you get a call, you might be sent over to help Grandma Newsbaum get her cat out of the tree. And then the next thing you know, you might be dealing with a dead teenager in the street. And that happens over and over and over and over again, and at the end of your shift, you go home and you try to go back and live normal and pat that stuff down. It's the same thing for educators,
You can't. Yeah.
You deal with all kinds of wacky, terrible stuff during the day, and a lot of joyful stuff too, but the bad stuff's really bad. And if you don't have time to self-reflect and think about that and feel it, at some point it's going to get you.
Yeah, it seeps, right? I talk about this as why the inside out work is so important is that, listen, most organizations hire me because they're like, right? Superintendents hire me because they're like, we want it better for our kids. We want it better for our staff. That's what they say every single time. You know this?
Yeah, but how about you?
Yeah. And Bob and I have had this conversation where 90% of my time is spent saying, great, if you want it better for the kids, if you want it better for family, if you want it better for the veterans you serve, if you want it better for the unhoused, it's internal. How do we first make it better inside? How do we help you get better? How do we help your team get better? How do you authentically do that so that whoever you're serving, even if you're making widgets to serve your customers and you want a better customer experience, how is it healthy internally first is so, so critical and authentically healthy. Not the, well, I'm at work, so I'm just going to tell you I have it because it's seeping. I say this all the time. You're a sponge. And even if you, as a person who kept my secret for 30 years,
Yep.
I thought it was locked in Davy Jones's closet at the bottom of Pirates of the Caribbean with Jack Sparrow having the key. I talked about this and good luck finding, that drunk rummy, right? Like you got like best of luck to you. It was seeping out even when I didn't know it was seeping out.
Oh, and it comes out in ways you wish it hadn't.
Yes.
And I think when I look back over the course of the last 25 years, my trauma seeped into things that caused me to be perceived or caused me to behave in a way that I wish I hadn't, right? I think of some of the times my wife was having surgery, or like when she was in the hospital having our youngest daughter, the way I behaved around the medical staff, like super hyper vigilant, ready to pounce on them. I feel awful about that. And I thought I was doing the right thing back then, right? I'm going to be in control of this. I'm going to make sure Tim and Abby are okay. But the reality of it was my own shit coming out. Excuse the language, but it was my own doing. I could have done that with kindness. I could have done that with letting people know, like, hey, I'm a veteran. I've got some issues. I'm sorry. That's not a great thing to say to people nowadays either, right? Like I'm still super careful about who I just told the whole world, but
Shen baited you into telling the whole world.
I'm super careful about telling people about that because, for a lot of people, it still comes with judgment. Oh, he couldn't handle it, or you weren't tough enough. And the reality of it, I don't think it should be called post-traumatic stress disorder because I don't think anyone can go into that environment without being a sociopath and not have it change who you are and affect your DNA in a way that you really need to do some difficult, intentional work to move forward.
Yeah, but I think that's the same reason I kept being in foster care a secret for 30 years. The myth that, and Bob, people still ask me today, what'd you do wrong? I mean, you must have done something pretty wrong that your parents couldn't love you. I mean, in modern society, I probably once a week get asked that question, right?
I got asked a couple weeks ago, so, hey, can I ask you a question about your son? Like, how did you not know? Like, can you tell me what was going wrong with him? Basically, it was a parent he had a child was having some issues and wanted to know what I had done wrong so they didn't do the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, wow, I appreciate the fact that you're reaching out for help, but the fact that, you're judging me that you think we did something wrong or my son did something wrong. I don't know. I go, if someone someone died of a heart attack and they were morbidly obese and didn't exercise and didn't take their medication, would you say they died because they made a mistake, or would you just say they just had a heart attack?
Yeah. It's tough. And I think we get so uncomfortable sometimes talking about suicide as well, right? I know when I talk about my own suicidal ideation, I can almost feel the room change. That, like, did someone just speak that out loud?
Yeah.
And the truth is we know a lot of people are suffering. And one of the only ways we can really wrap our hands around it is to start talking about it and to start normalize talking about it so that people can get more help. So I've baited Bob into talking about being a veteran, about using PTSD, because it's important that Bob share his story and others share their stories because stories matter.
They do.
Stories matter and all kinds of stories matter. So, Bob, we're coming kind of to the end. I want to leave some time. I have some quick fire questions, always fun quick fire questions. But before we get there, what's one piece of advice you'd give to aspiring leaders who need to make a significant change in their field?
I think being willing to do the work and being authentic, right? We just talked about suicide and veterans and myself and yourself. And I think you got to be authentic about that, right? It was interesting when I went to the VA to file a claim and I was having trouble, like I'd mentioned earlier. Maybe I didn't tell that story, but it was kind of interesting. I went to the VA, right? Filed for a claim for PTSD. The psychologist was interviewing me. It was awful. I was getting nowhere. And she said, you should go to lunch and come back, or you should go out there and get your wife and bring her in here. So I went out and got my wife and brought her into the room. And, the psychologist said to my wife, well, what's up with him? She's like, well, I don't know. She's like, the first 10 years we were married, I thought he was just an enormous pain in the ass. And then I started doing some reading and she said, well, describe what had happened. And I described one of the flare-ups that I had when I was a police officer, when a guy burned to death in a car and we couldn't get him out and just had watched him burn. And then my wife looked at the psychologist right in the eye. And she's like, well, the psychologist said, what was his biggest symptom? And she looked at the psychologist right in the eye. She said, he was suicidal. And I think that's the first time my wife had ever said that out loud. And we were left and I was like, I didn't realize you realized how bad it was. She goes, I know how bad it was. She just, that's why I worked so hard at getting you some help. So to answer your question, I think is, number one, be willing to do the work on yourself. And number two, do the work. And again, I think you got to be intentional about it, right? Did I want to leave home for 6 weeks and go spend time on her? And it sounds like a vacation, and it was anything but a vacation. There was a lot of difficult days of soul searching, but you got to be almost willing to do that level of work, however that looks for you, to be able to move forward and grow into the person you want to be, the person you should be, right? I mean, it really doesn't have anything to do with it, the person you should be.
So, Bob, what excites you most about the future? Try to leave on a high note. What excites you most about the future, whether that's in education or workforce development or your plans or what you have coming up? What excites you the most?
I don't sound like an optimist, but I am. I think there's a lot of potential for this work, right? If we can connect to people that are willing to engage in it. What excites me, honestly, for myself, I look forward to being able to share my story with folks, not only as an example. I don't think everyone needs to go ride horses and do hippie stuff in Montana. That was for me. But find that works for you. Find what works for you and do it. And sharing my story in a way that can help other people say, if Bob is able to do it, maybe I can do it, or maybe Bob can help me. Stories matter. When people hear your story, it really, really matters, right? And I think the other thing that I'm optimistic about is there is a lot of grace in people's lives, and it's a practice that, particularly when you're so profoundly sad or you're in such a bad way as a leader where you feel like you're completely depleted, there's a lot of grace in your life that you're not able to see. And that's probably one of the biggest gifts about my transformation is I'm able to extend unconditional love, feel unconditional love, and also see the gifts in my life, right? Like I could say, man, I'm no longer doing what I love to do per se, but there's a lot of people that have surfaced that have been there for me to help me, right? In a really strange times where the energy of the universe, you kind of question, like, how did that happen today, right? I was out at my hunting camp in northern Michigan a couple of weeks ago, and I do this thing where I make prayer ties for people that I've lost, right? And I lost my mom and dad within 6 months and my son within that same 3-year time period. And I was making some prayer ties, and I thought to myself, man, I haven't talked to Luke in a couple of weeks. And the strangest thing, I get done making prayer ties, my phone dings, and it's Luke. He's like, haven't talked to you in a while. How's things going?
Right? The winks.
And I'm not trying to.
No, it's the winks of the world as we talk.
Yes.
So, Bob, does this mean our listeners might expect a book from you about your own story sometime soon?
Yeah, I'm working on it. And I think I'm about to 15,000 words now. I hope I can bring that to closure. I think I can.
We love it.
I have some really great stuff that I've written in my journal from Montana that I want to include in that as well. So I look forward to sharing my story, and I hope to bring my book to print here one of these days.
We'll look forward to it. We'll share it with all of our listeners. We hope you'll come on the show again. Yeah.
Always.
So tell us, what book, TV show are you binge watching right now, or that's standing out to you, something that's caught your attention recently?
I've been reading a lot about horsemanship, honestly, and it's kind of a boring topic, I guess, for some folks. But recently I've been reading a book by a horseman by the name of Ray Hunt. He's passed away. But it's interesting. People always think about quote unquote breaking horses or training horses. And I've gotten into horses. If you haven't noticed, I actually own a Mustang named Two Socks. who's my buddy. But, the interesting thing about horses is they're a mirror to your soul. They'll give you right back what you give them. And what Ray said in this book that I'm reading, it is, when you're working on a horse, you're working on yourself. You think you're training a horse, you're working on yourself. And I think that's really, really important, right? Like, to your point, I'm doing trauma-informed work with my organization. And, maybe to me, when I first started working with you, Shen, it felt like a little bit of cop-out, right? Like I brought Shen into the organization and now I can start working on myself. The truth of the matter is, until I started working with myself, I couldn't bring Shen into the organization in an authentic kind of way, right?
Yeah.
I don't you remember you and I sitting on the bar stools in front of 1,500 teachers going back and forth and, kind of sharing with the room about my daughter. And I think you could have heard a pin drop. But until you're able as a leader to share those types of things in an authentic kind of way, we lose so much capacity with people because they think you're the hard outside shell like me, right? Oh, look at the Marine. He's a hard ass, he's going to give orders, make people do stuff. And little do they know that, I was a pretty damaged person on the inside.
Yeah. And I think that's true for all of us, no matter where you are in the organization, is that you have the power to be authentically you. And when we all tap into that, I think we're better off as organizations and systems. I think it's what we're missing right now in organizations and systems.
I think you're better off in society like that, right? Like, what's wrong with offering people unconditional love? That doesn't mean you have to love what they're doing. You have to condone what they're doing, but you can live with unconditional love.
Yeah. It's a perfect note for us to end on. Bob, as always, it's been a pleasure having you on. Until next time, my friend, is there a way that people can get in touch with you, or what's the best platform of social media you prefer?
Oh, probably LinkedIn. You can just type my name in and it'll come right up.
All right. Awesome. We'll make sure there's links in this for everyone who's listening. Until next time, please remember, take it one step at a time. Thanks, everybody. Mindful Management, Creating a Trauma-Informed Work Environment is brought to you by Chefalo Consulting. To learn more about Chefalo Consulting and our trauma-informed change management and professional development solutions, please visit chefaloconsulting.com. That's Chefalo, CHEFALO, consulting.com. Make sure you don't miss these transformative conversations by subscribing to Mindful Management wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for listening. And remember, change happens one step at a time.